the only thing that would have been earth-shattering or life-altering about my abortion is if I couldn't have had one.
And so for me, it took me time, even as someone would call me an expert on reproductive rights, for me to say I had an abortion.
Everybody could relate, and everybody knows somebody who has had an abortion.
Hi everyone, I'm Akila Radhakrishnan, the president of the Global Justice Center. It's my delight to welcome you to this conversation with one of GJC's board members, Shannon Singh. Shannon, thank you so much for your time in this conversation. As many of you know, one of GJC's major areas of work is to ensure that abortion access is respected, protected, and fulfilled as a fundamental human right. And in the present moment, it's a topic that's on so many of our minds after the overturning of Roe v. Wade earlier this year in the United States. As we've watched the decision wreak havoc on people's lives all over the United States, we've also watched pregnant people all over the country step forward to share their experiences of navigating the post-Dobbs reality in the United States. It's through these stories and experiences that we're able to understand the human impact and harms of the decision. This narrative work builds on a much longer tradition of abortion storytelling, including over 300 prominent French women in the arts who had abortions and signed a public manifesto demanding abortion access in 1971, or a similar statement in the United States in 1972 in Ms. Magazine, or more recently, the work on abortion storytelling done by organizations like We Testify. Abortion storytelling is a powerful counter to pervasive and dominant narratives that perpetuate abortion stigma and efforts to single out and relegate abortion to the shadows. Abortion is, in fact, very common. In the US, 1 in 4 women will have an abortion in their lifetime. Shannon and I are both a part of that statistic, and that's why we're here sitting down together today to talk about abortion through our own personal experiences of having had them and the impact that's had on our lives, and why we're both passionate about ensuring reproductive rights, particularly abortion access for all. Shannon, let's start. What prompted you to want to share your abortion story more widely?
I think the short answer is that the right is under assault. And I have been really impacted by the bravery of all the people, as you described, sharing their stories. And I've really been struck by, people sharing the human cost of what what abortion access means to them. And so many of these stories I found, they're incredibly traumatic. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of stories about, horrible tales of rape and incest and the enormous toll that it can take when someone could or couldn't access, the right to abortion. And I always was worried that my story, I haven't told it very often or very widely. And that's because it's sort of a non-story. I thought it really wasn't worth sharing for all the reasons I'll get into. It was both physically and emotionally non-traumatic. I had already had 1 kid and I knew I wanted a second. I was married at the time. We could support a kid. But the truth is, I wasn't ready to have another kid. Mm-hmm. And I never want anybody to take away from all of the brave stories being shared that you need traumatic or extenuating circumstances to deserve the right to access abortion. That we all deserve the right to access it and the right to make choices about when and where and with who we take a decision to have a child. And so I just wanted to add my very small story to the mix, which is actually quite a positive story of an abortion that went really smoothly and which really has empowered me to do the work that I want to do.
And this is the same. This is when we first talked about this, right? Yeah. I have a very similar perspective. I feel like I had an abortion experience, an unwanted pregnancy experience that went exactly as it should for anybody.
Yeah.
Right? Where I was able to, without coercion or influence, make a decision about what was best for me. I had the support that I needed from family, from friends who were, who didn't behave in any way that caused me to have pause. They were affirming and supportive about whatever it is that I wanted to do. I lived in a state where it was easy to access abortion. At the time, I had just graduated from law school. I didn't have health insurance because it was in between getting a job. I had just taken the bar exam. And the state of California has public funding that actually funds abortion services. We know that's one of the biggest barriers for so many people is the funding. I was able to access funding at that point in time. I was able to go to a clinic where there was nobody protesting outside. Nobody was screaming horrible things at me. And so it's the same as you. It's a non-story.
It's a non-story.
In some ways.
And I like to say, like, the only thing that would have been earth-shattering or life-altering about my abortion is if I couldn't have had one. As it was really a smooth process. It was a moment that, I don't regret and really has made me left feeling really empowered in the work that I do. And I feel strongly that just there should be this whole range of stories shared, because as you say, if 1 in 4 people, are going to access the right to abortion in their lifetime, this is not a rare thing. This is common.
Mm-hmm. And it's actually, I think the statistic is that 60% of those who have an abortion already have a child. So you're also in another common statistic there.
And I think that's important too, because, as I'll talk about, being a mother, being a parent has been one of the absolute greatest joys of my whole life. Both of my kids were planned pregnancies that me and my husband prayed for and were so grateful for. And, it's impossible for me to talk about my kids without glowing. Mm-hmm. But that's also because I was able to have them when I wanted and time my career, my finances, the other elements of my life around this decision. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And it's, one thing for me that I often think about is when I first started talking about having an abortion, it was actually years into doing this work. Yeah. So I was a public advocate for abortion. I was a reproductive rights lawyer. I was a human rights lawyer. And I always talked about it in the abstract, right? I always talked about what, I was like, this is why women need access to abortion. This is why pregnant people need access to abortion. This is why it's so important about the potential impact on people's lives, as you're talking about around your career, your choices, your finances. And at some point I was like, but why aren't you talking about the fact that that's you?
Right.
Right? It was, for me, that was the choice. It was not the right time for me to have a child. It would have, again, just graduated from law school, a ton of debt. I had an opportunity to move across the country to actually start doing this work, to move to New York, and that would not have been possible. Right? And so it struck me at a certain point about, why is it that I'm stigmatizing abortion myself, even though I believe so strongly in it as a right, and I'm out there writing articles about why it's needed. I'm out there advocating to countries about their policies on abortion, but I didn't ever really speak about my abortion other than in the context of the time when I needed one and I sought out my friends and others to help support me. And so, that's one thing I think is so interesting about our conversation is both of us are very committed to this work, but it didn't come naturally for either of us to make it personal.
No. And what was the trigger that made you decide to share your story?
Well, I saw others were doing it. And, I can't remember the exact trigger, but I think a part of it was that I reached a point in my career where I felt that it had value for me to say something about it. It was when I was young and I was building my career, there's so much around what are we allowed to talk about? Who are we allowed to be? Like, I wanted to be seen as professional. I also wanted to be seen as objective, right? So that when I was making these arguments about rights and the law, it wasn't you're just impassioned because this is personal. And I wanted to be like, no, I'm a lawyer. I'm a professional. I know why this is. And it, I think after doing this work, and I think particularly some of it was also working with grassroots actors, not on abortion, but on a range of issues, not inside the United States, really listening to the way that they melded the personal, the political, what they did, right? That clear separation wasn't decided in abortion. I think in particular is something that's stigmatized, that if I applied for a job and someone's like, why are you out there talking publicly about your abortion? Like, that could impact me. But at a certain point, I was like, I think it's going to be okay.
Yeah, exactly.
And maybe a good.
And maybe a good. And maybe by sharing sort of just this breadth of stories, it can help people feel like this is something that's relatable. This is something that doesn't have to be traumatic. And here's examples of when actually it went pretty smoothly. It went right. I mean, you had what you needed to make an informed decision that you feel good about.
Yeah. What would you say has been like the impact for you?
What I would go back to is before getting into my story, I wanted to just share a little bit about the personal and professional context under which I made this decision. And that's that I had taken a huge amount of personal and professional sacrifice to pursue a career in international criminal law. And I don't say that because that career requires any more sacrifice than another career, but just all of us, we work hard to get where we want to get in our careers. You know, we're all navigating a lot of constraints. And in my case, I knew this was the field I wanted. I left a lucrative job in private practice at a law firm in San Francisco to move my husband and I across the world to The Hague to pursue this field. And I got a job in international criminal law at the tribunals there. And one of the things that's interesting about that field is the contracts are really short term because of the very unstable funding. You know, it's 4 or 6 month contracts at some of the tribunals. And that's hard on a lot of people, but one of the groups that's really hard on is people who want to start a family. So my contract had just ended a couple weeks before I gave birth to my son. And what it meant was that I took not a maternity leave that was paid, but I just took a stint of time unpaid between contracts with my son and worked really, really hard to get back in the field and get a contract when he was a few months old. And I still remember, we had to do like a timed written exam, as I'm sure you've had to do. And, you had a couple of hours to do it. And I had a baby in the next room. And so I had like maybe half the time. And I was writing as fast as I could, praying he didn't wake up, like in between diaper changes and naps. And so when I got a contract back in the field, it meant so much to me to kind of find my way back and navigate the personal and the professional and what is it going to look like to be able to work around breastfeeding. And I had to race over on my lunch breaks to help nurse because my son wouldn't take a bottle. And so it was really hard. And when I got pregnant again on accident, my son was only a year old. And I really felt like my career, my body were just kind of coming back on track. And I really wasn't ready. Like, I wasn't ready to drop my contract. I wasn't ready to have my body go back into truly a 2-year period between the pregnancy, the birth, the breastfeeding, the recovery, stitches, whatever it takes. And so, I made the choice. I was living in the Netherlands at the time, and the Netherlands has a fabulous healthcare system, free, accessible. I went to a beautiful, like, leafy green street, quiet, peaceful, no protesters, went in, had an informed conversation with my doctor, had an informed conversation with my partner, and had a really straightforward medical abortion. I took the abortion pill, and I left room for myself to have repercussions, physical ones or emotional ones. I was prepared to be quite mixed in my emotions in the days and months after. And in fact, I wasn't. This wasn't a decision I regretted. This was something I felt really good about because it was the right thing for my family and my career. And the last thing I'll say is parenting is really hard work. It's really hard. And I think you really have the right to choose. If you are going to put your heart and soul into parenting, you get to decide when you're going to do that and make those sacrifices. I mean, I just think if you're going to put your heart and soul into parenting, you get to decide when and where and with who you are going to make that life-altering decision. And it's such an important part of your autonomy and your equality and fullness as a person.
Yeah. No, and I remember in 2016, there was actually an effort where a bunch of women who were attorneys signed an amicus brief to the Supreme Court in the June medical case to say, hey, we as attorneys have had abortions. This had a net positive impact on our lives. It allowed us to pursue our careers in the law, you know, a way to try to speak to the justices about exactly what you're talking about, right? Like, becoming a lawyer, it's hard work.
It's hard work. It is.
You know?
Yeah.
And I think back to the fact that, like, it was just after I took the bar exam, which was hell. I think you took the California bar too, right? It was like, it was like 3 days. I was like, so that was just like exactly not what I needed in that moment in time after law school, after the bar exam. And did I want to give up an opportunity to move across the country to be able to do this work? And that's the choice that I was faced with. And it was very easy.
Yeah.
It actually, like, it didn't take that much soul searching, if I'm being completely honest.
No, and the other thing I always wondered was, I knew, you know, again, I had my son, and I knew that we wanted a second child. So I had a little bit of soul searching there.
I actually think the first time we met, you were pregnant with your second child.
I think that's right. And I knew I wanted a second child. And so I was wondering, you know, am I going to really feel mixed about making this choice now? Or am I going to have, like, long-term health repercussions that are going to make it more difficult for me to get pregnant? And, like, I'm really happy to share. I mean, I got pregnant really easily when I was ready to. My daughter's about to turn 2. And again, like, the timing was when I wanted it and when it worked for my family. And that's everything.
And you were able to get accurate medical information.
Absolutely.
Right? One of the things we've been talking about is, like, a part of destigmatizing it is understanding abortion as a really straightforward, super safe procedure.
Yeah.
You know, it's safer than pregnancy, actually, to be able to have an abortion under, like, the safe circumstances and conditions, right? Whether it's the pill, whether it's surgical abortion. And so the importance of, I think, being able to go to a doctor, have a conversation, have them give you accurate medical information so you can make a decision what you want. Like, one of the things that I think about this moment that's scary is how much disinformation there's out there, particularly online.
Completely.
You know, in some states in the U.S., they actually make doctors lie about connections between having an abortion and increased rates of breast cancer.
And I'm worried that this like super inflammatory political climate is going to contribute to, like, another wave of people really being silent about the impact that the right to access abortion has had on their life. And I think it's really important that anybody who has benefited from this right, speak up if you can. If you are so privileged to be in that position, to speak up. And I will say, I'd really like to hear a lot more cis men talking about how the right to abortion has impacted their lives, because it's not just women that have benefited from this right, and it's not a small minority of people.
Your husband certainly benefited.
Absolutely, my husband benefited, and his career benefited, and our family benefited, and our finances benefited. So again, like, let's be real about how often and how impactful accessing this right is.
Yeah. And, you know, and I think about, right, like, in the context of people that I know, there's people like us who've had abortions in the circumstances we're describing. There's people who have to have abortions for very wanted pregnancies.
Very.
You know, that for whatever reason don't go the way that they need them to, put the pregnant person's life at risk. And, you know, just thinking about this full continuum of why we need to really be thinking about everything that we can do now to make sure that abortion remains accessible in this moment, right? Which ties to, I think, why you're on our board maybe, and the work that we do.
Yeah. And how do you feel like this has really impacted your work? You know, being able to kind of have this personal story woven into the broader narrative of GJC's mission and the work.
Well, I think one thing that's helpful in the face of some of the counter narratives you can face in the advocacy is to be able to say, this is not abstract to me, right? So when you say, but what about X or Y? It's like, well, the personal can sometimes be helpful in the work and in the advocacy, right? Because it's not just well, I know someone who once had an abortion and they had it and it was fine and it was a positive impact and there were no, you know, like common things that are used to dismiss arguments for abortion. It's like, well, no, they're my experiences. So I can tell you the statistics I can tell you the rights, I can tell you the laws, and then I can also tell you like exactly how that's played out in my experience.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we're doing here today is bringing that back, because I think it counters so many reasons as to why people think abortion is some sort of like luxury.
Completely. And I think just so fundamental to the ability to have autonomy, to have equality, to be the sort of advocate you want. And boy, would the international human rights law space be so much worse if we were to start excluding the voices of people who, had to drop out of the workforce or take different roles or more limited roles or have more limited voices because they were forced to carry a pregnancy that they didn't want to carry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think about, all spaces, right? That one of the things we're looking at now is how this may have an impact in an environment, by the way, where we already saw mass resignations of women from the workplace during COVID. And now thinking about how is this going to play out? What is this the impact that this is going to have on, major progress that's been made in the last 30 years, and particularly thinking as well about, you and I were also very lucky and privileged, right? In many ways, in that moment in time, in terms of where we lived, financial resources, even like the community that surrounded us. But thinking about, the impact that this is going to have on marginalized populations who are disproportionately going to feel the effects of this decision, and, where barriers into education, barriers into the workforce, it's really the generational impact is the thing that it probably daunts me the most at this point.
No, the hammer isn't falling evenly. It's the disproportionate impacts on women, on people of color, on marginalized populations are severe. And these are not voices that we want excluded from public spaces, from public life. Like, this is about building sort of an inclusive movement. And I think people being real about what the right has meant to them and how it's changed their life. And again, in my case, how not being able to access the right would have dramatically changed my life in a way that I didn't want.
And one of the things, the way you're talking about your decision making, the stories, is also, I think what it does is also demonstrates the lived reality of something like reproductive rights and reproductive choice, right? Because it's not an abstract decision. It's interconnected to your ability to exercise and live your life on your terms, right? It's about, we're human rights lawyers, right? So we talk about the human rights framework, but it's about kind of, it implicates a range of rights that you have. It's not and it's always people say to me, well, abortion, it's not like, there's no place where it says it's an international human right in and of itself. And I think that's because of exactly this. It's a right in the framework. It's a part of your right to life. It's a part of your right to health. It's a part of your, your right to, your economic rights, your right to participate equally in education, in the workplace, without discrimination based on gender. And so it to me, it makes perfect sense that it's almost not enumerated singularly, because why it's important, why you need it can be different depending on who you are, but it's a very fulsome and interconnected set of impacts.
It's inextricable from other rights. And, people talk about freedom of expression as an enabling right, right? That brings to life and gives meaning to so many other fundamental human rights. And I would say the right to access abortion is the same. It is an enabling right that enables equality and non-discrimination and health and participation and everything else you've mentioned. And I think for that reason, like, the idea of restricting that right is you restrict an enormous, vast range of rights that really fundamentally would change the human rights landscape.
Yeah. And what's the way we're talking about this? It's so interesting because it's exactly what prompted me to speak out about my abortion story. So I could do what we just did in the last 3 minutes. That's what I was professionally trained to do, right? I could talk about why it's a right, why it's important in the abstract, but I often never, at least publicly, never connected it to me, right? I always thought that was maybe some sort of weakness for me to, that, it could be and it could be potentially harmful in terms of the career that you want because of people's feelings on abortion, to be very public and proud that you had an abortion.
Yeah.
Right? And so for me, it took me time, even as someone would call me an expert on reproductive rights, for me to say I had an abortion. And so, this melding that we're doing here, where we're able to talk about what we know, what we've been trained for, what we academically do, what we professionally do, but how that interacts, because, in terms of it, as practitioners, as human rights practitioners, we're also human. And so these are our own experiences, our own rights that are being implicated. And I do think that this dichotomy of the personal and the professional, particularly for women, you and I are both women of color, there are real risks associated sometimes with being public about it.
There are. There's real risks. There's real risk of opening yourself up for targeting and being targeted for the both personal and the professional on the basis of having made a choice like this. But again, I really feel like it's our responsibility if we're, as human rights advocates and as people who have benefited from this right, that, there's many people who are far less at liberty to speak up about their experiences. So if my small story can share that, yes, people who are happily mothers, can and have had abortions.
Yeah, and I think in this landscape, because it's, there's so many narratives about abortion that have been perpetuated by those who are anti-abortion. And so much of that has allowed us to, even those of us who advocate and support it, I've never felt conflicted about whether or not I'm pro-abortion.
Yeah.
But even in my own head, sometimes we stigmatize the narratives around it. We've internalized it so much, right? To say, well, we don't talk about it. It's a private decision. Abortion should be safe, legal, and rare. Like, there's so many things that, and remember, safe, legal, and rare was something that was said by, it was the Clintons, right? It was a Democratic framing about what it is. And it's like, why does it need to be rare?
Right.
For example, right?
The facts are, it's not rare.
And it's not.
So...
But the idea that that's what we should be going towards is what I think is fascinating about how so much of the conversation around abortion and the stigma around abortion has been internalized and then regurgitated by us.
One of the things that I think is fascinating is, as I said, I only shared at the time that I was having an abortion with a few really, really trusted friends or family members. I thought it was all the things you say. It's a personal decision and you don't want to open yourself up for stigmatization and, this internalization of a sense that you've made a mistake or done something wrong. But what was fascinating was even within the very, very small circle I shared it with, how many other people in my life said, oh, I did too. Oh, I just never told anybody. Oh, in my generation, you weren't meant to mention it. But, oh, yeah, everybody could relate. And everybody knows somebody who has had an abortion. So if that many of us are benefiting from this right, and this right is under threat today, I think we need to be a bit louder. And that's why I'm so proud to be part of GJC's board, and this incredible advocacy and really taking a feminist lens to the debate, really grounding the right in international human rights standards and frameworks to strengthen the protections. I mean, I have been so impressed by the advocacy and the brilliance and the creativity of the legal arguments. And the fact that this resonates with me on a personal level has made my involvement in the board that much more meaningful.
Yeah, and it is, doing women's rights work as a woman, it's fascinating.
Yeah, it is.
Because there's so many places where what you're supposed to talk about or how you're supposed to talk about it is academic.
Yeah.
Right? And so, but this is our lives, this is our lived reality. And so I'm happy to also be in a place and at an organization where we can find the ways to allow people to bring their essential humanness to the work.
and their full selves and their diversity of experiences and stories. And that's why, like, again, I am so grateful for all the people who've shared these super brave stories about, you know, very, very traumatic experiences, and a true, absolute, fundamental need to access abortion. But I also think that we need to be vocal, even if the story was non-traumatic, and it was smooth and it was safe. And
Well, and that's what we want to build back to.
yeah.
Right? You know, we don't want to end up in a legal landscape and a policy landscape as we think about what we want in this country is not one that's just focused on exceptions, right? On the difficult cases. We want to build back to a landscape, and one, by the way, that, you know, Roe didn't necessarily provide, particularly for marginalized populations, that actually just brings the space of abortion access to anyone who wants it with the financial resources that they need to access it, without stigma, without being yelled at or screamed at. I mean, you know, well, you talk about, you were in the Netherlands, I was in California, and guess what? We did have that.
Absolutely.
Right? So we know what that world can look like when it works the way it's supposed to.
I can't tell you what a peace, calm environment it was, too. I mean, I mentioned the beautiful street in Amsterdam. This was Ellenby. It was like this beautiful sunny day, and I walked in, and it was quiet. And it was it was a clean, safe medical office. It was a thoughtful, sensitive doctor. Mm-hmm. She made sure that I was emotionally okay. Mm-hmm. She made sure that I was informed. And I think all of those factors contributed to the smoothness of the whole experience for me and my lack of regret over the decision that I made.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's important, right, that you're not accessing, you know, having people who are mistrusting you or having to provide information that is inaccurate as you go through this. It's it is a personal decision.
Yeah.
Right? And so you should just be supported through it as you should be with any other medical care that you need.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right. Well, Shannon, thank you so much for this conversation, for, you know, wanting to kind of delve into this work with us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for the chance. Thank you for the advocacy. I'm so amazed by everything GJC has done and continues to do, and it's just an honor to be on your board and part of the organization.
Thank you.